Stack Overflow is a legendary question and answer site for programmers and is likely well known to most SEDaily listeners. Svelte is an open-source front-end framework that was released in 2016 and continues to grow rapidly in popularity. Giamir Buoncristiani is a staff software engineer at Stack Overflow. He is also the tech lead for the Stack's design team. Giamir joins the podcast to talk about modernizing Stack Overflow's front-end user interface and why the team has embraced Svelte. Gregor Vand is a security-focused technologist and is the founder and CTO of MailPass. Previously, Gregor was a CTO across cybersecurity, cyber insurance, and general software engineering companies. He has been based in Asia Pacific for almost a decade and can be found via his profile at vand.hk.
Hi, Giamir. Welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hello, Gregor. Happy to be here today.
Yeah, so Giamir, you are a staff software engineer at Stack Overflow. I don't think the platform needs any introduction to our listener base. And that's kind of what makes this one exciting today, that we get to peel back some of the curtain a little bit on probably a platform that I imagine virtually every technical listener has used at some point in their career. So let's also just hear, before we get into kind of today's topic, which is basically all around using Svelte at Stack Overflow. What did you do before Stack Overflow? What was your path to Stack Overflow?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to start with saying that I'm Italian. So I studied computer engineering actually in Italy, in Pisa. But I was always passionate about user interface development, since the very beginning. That's actually what drew me to what I'm doing today. So I used to be one of these people, right? That maintains CMS, WordPress for small to medium businesses. That's how I started actually. And I got excited about web development in general. And then after my study, I left Italy. I decided to move to UK, where I actually started what I consider my first professional position, right? Because I was lucky enough to enter in a relatively well-known consultancy named ThoughtWorks. And as a consultant, really, I was able to experience a variety of domain and projects. So I also got to travel quite a bit being a consultant, and work different industries, between UK and Germany as well. So when I was at ThoughtWorks, I actually, let's say, continue developing, right? My career as a UI developer expert, and this kind of bring us to today, to a few years ago, where I decided actually to take a break from consulting and move to a product company. There was this great opportunity where Stack Overflow's design system team was looking for an experienced engineer that could help the organization transition from, let's say, using outdated technology really when it comes to user interface development to something that's a bit more modern, it's a bit fresh. And I was lucky enough to get hired, and that's where it all started, let's say. So we were able over the last 2 years, to experiment a bit and slowly start, let's say, a journey with the organization, to move towards modern front-end development. I mean, we're still in it, of course. Stack Overflow is, you can imagine, the company started in 2008. So a lot of the new shiny things that we are all using today, weren't a thing back then, right? jQuery was already around, right? Which was great, back then, because the browsers standards, they were all different from each other. But so that's a little bit about myself and how I landed this position, in Stack Overflow. So I'm really excited, actually, to get also the opportunity to give back to the community to an extent. I mean, probably every engineer that started around my time, in the late 2000, started with software development. They use Stack Overflow to learn, right, and create their own careers often. Like, and I felt this is super opportunity that I like to feel like I'm giving back something that I learned over all these years. Like, and yeah, I'm still excited to be there.
Oh yeah, it is exciting. And yeah, I mean, the number of things that Stack Overflow has solved for me, I think the first ever question I put up there was, we had a regex problem and some regex wizard came on and talked about it being what's called catastrophic backtracking. And I just thought, oh my God, this community, you can find literally the most, esoteric knowledge leaders on this platform. And even today, I still, obviously, maybe we'll get onto some of this topic, LLMs have obviously probably cut into sort of how much it's used. I still find there are easily much better answers coming out of Stack Overflow than what an LLM can give me on some things. But that's not quite the topic for today. The topic for today is how Stack Overflow is even built itself. And you sort of came to my attention when you did an episode for the Stack Overflow podcast back in 2023. And that was, the word that piqued my interest was Svelte, because back then I was also kicking off a new project and I had decided this was now the first production project I was going to kick off with Svelte. So to see Stack Overflow talking about it, using it in production was a huge, really helped me confirm that choice, shall we say. So let's go back there a little bit. That was back in 2023. What were the challenges that you were kind of needing to solve with what the front end was at before bringing Svelte in? Let's start there.
Yeah, many challenges. So as I was saying, Stack Overflow, stackoverflow.com and the Stack Exchange network, it's old, right, to understand. Like, the software project started in 2008 and most of the UIs were built and are still today built with ASP.NET MVC beta, and then the Razor as a view engine, right? So the majority of our code is written in C# and .NET, right? So Razor is kind of the de facto view engine, right? For C#. And of course, that gives you all the HTML you need, and Stack Overflow, especially even today, to understand, right? There's a lot of static content on it, and that's great, right? You just serve some HTML and that's it. But as the landscape and technology has changed, a user has more expectation, you start to add interactivity, to at least to certain pages, you of course need to use JavaScript, right? And of course back then there was jQuery, which was great because of all the cross-browser problem, compatibility problem that there were back then, right? So, and honestly, jQuery, it's the majority of the JavaScript code actually that we still have in our code base. Right? So Stack Overflow was developed as a monolith, right? So, and as of today we are actually on a journey of breaking down the monolith towards a more distributed architecture. But still, as of today, I would say that the core stuff, right, of Stack Overflow still lives within this monolith, right? So yeah, just an interesting fact, NPM and Webpack, right, which is something that, today there is also Vite actually, Webpack just feel already old, right, to an extent, right? But let's say NPM and Node and bundlers, right, they are tools that are probably using in any front-end project, right? Stack Overflow, we didn't have those until 2021. So we introduced those tools and those bundles quite late. But those was also the effort that put us in a situation where we could start to explore more modern approaches, right? To UI development, right? And also ultimately what allowed us to introduce Svelte, right? For in some part of our code base. So in terms of, challenges, we actually listened to our engineers, right? And how it was their, let's say, experience working with building UIs in general. And what we realized is that 65% of our engineers actually, back in January 2023, was still using jQuery as their primary tool to add interactivity to UI, right? And almost all of them, they were considering the tech at their disposal not adequate. And me being part of the let's say, front-end platform team, like to an extent, right? Like we were responsible to actually try to change that, like, and bring some modern tool to those individuals that are essentially building stackoverflow.com as you see it every day, right? Like, so our product engineers. And also there were other benefits, right, that we were hoping to gain by introducing something modern. Last but not least, I would say attracting and retaining front-end talents, right? Because of course you can imagine you say, Stack Overflow is great, but when you actually join a company and say, okay, all the UI development is done in jQuery as a front-end engineer, you just say, okay, do I really wanna be here? Like, does it make sense? Right? So we just wanted to make sure to introduce also pathway, right? Like that get people excited, like about UI development again, and don't start to see UI development as a chore, right? Like, okay, now I need to build some UI and it's gonna be in jQuery, like, and it's, you don't get all this type benefit using TypeScript, for example. So yeah, so this is kind of the situation that we were in, right?
Super interesting. And I mean, I guess what strikes me from the outside is that it doesn't feel, and this might already sound terrible to someone working at Stack Overflow, it doesn't feel like the platform, and this is a positive thing, has needed to change much over the years.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that maybe do you think that kind of drove some of the stasis, I guess, is kind of what you were describing of like, why would we need to change? If it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. And actually it was the developer experience that, like the internal developer experience that was driving more of this perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. The people developing Stack Overflow has been always like a relatively small group of engineers. And I would say that most of them, they consider themselves full stack engineers, and they are, the majority of our engineers are very experienced, like with .NET and C#, and funnily enough, like the other day I was looking at some .NET MVC tutorial and they're still recommending to use jQuery, right? Like as the tool of choice, right? Like to actually add some interactivity to the Razor pages, right? So that's probably also why, like, there was never like a thought of saying maybe we should just move on, right? Like that's one part. The other part is that StackOverflow.com and the Stack Exchange network, they're very mature products. They, our community really, get accustomed like to certain feature, the way they work, right? Like, and changing things in general, like just do big rehaul of how things work. Like it's not simple, right? Like, because you need to make sure that you get feedback from the community and you don't do anything abrupt, right? Like, so at the same time though, like at Stack Overflow, we are not developing just what we call the public platform, right? Like what you see every day if you go to stackoverflow.com. We have also other products, right? And those were the products that I feel they were suffering like a bit more as well, like, because essentially in there, like we were building private instance of Stack Overflow for different customers. And you can imagine that the pace of innovation there need to be much faster, right? Like, because expectations are a bit different. So, and thinking of, innovating around UI with a technology such as jQuery, like, I mean, you certainly can do some stuff, but it's a bit difficult. Maybe later we will go and talk a little bit more about, the differences like between jQuery, like, and this procedural way, right? Like of actually describing your UI, right? Like passing all these imperative instruction as opposed to what we got used to these days, like with the component-based framework. This is not just Svelte, but any of the new UI framework that allow you to be more declarative, right? Like when you describe your UI. So that's a little bit the background, I guess, like of why, like, there wasn't maybe a big need like for something shiny and new. And in general, I have to say that if you're not into the UI ecosystem as an engineer, let's say, you look at what's happening in the JavaScript world and you feel these people are crazy, right? Like they're just innovating so much. Everything's changing every other week, right? Like today we have, AngularJS, the day after there is React, and then, now, now we have Vue, Svelte. I mean, things have gotten better, I would say, and have stabilized a bit. But as a maybe more backend type of engineer, just say, oh, maybe I should just stick to my old-fashioned jQuery, and stay on the safe side.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There was a period it was moving almost too fast. Great to innovate, yes, but if you can't sort of wake up another week and there's now another framework and someone else is saying, oh, why don't you use this or why don't you use that? And, I think we've had a few episodes where these kind of discussions have played out of sort of the problem, as you say, it has got a lot better, but the problem with front end for a long time was just simply too much choice, what to choose, and and defend that to whoever is asking you to build this thing. I guess I was lucky in this respect that when I chose Svelte, I was choosing it as the founder of the company. So I can, I've only got myself to blame at the end if it was the wrong choice. But I was really persuaded by a fairly old video now, but is it one of the first videos that Rich Harris, the creator of Svelte, put out. And I was really persuaded by the argument, basically that video was all about how Svelte works under the hood and that it compiles rather than re-rendering the DOM every sort of millisecond. So, okay, we sort of understand why Stack Overflow had to at least look ahead and try and say, okay, we need to innovate on the front end, not across the entire product. That's too much, but in certain areas. How did you land on Svelte in this case?
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting story because initially, there was so much option. As again, like an example of the JavaScript fatigue, right? Like you could have gone like with, the classic, I think most organizations today, they use React or maybe Angular, like if you're more into the, enterprisey type of industries. But yeah, we actually took our time, like as a front-end platform team, and we did a little bit of discovery, understand the things that also were important to us, like from architecture characteristics, right? Like, and what we wanted for Stack Overflow, also talking to the other engineers. So few things that I can mention is that we certainly look at developer experience, right? So we wanted to make sure that when somebody would actually build something in Svelte with this new UI framework that wasn't really specified, then like they could just have a great developer experience within their IDE. They could iterate very fast and leverage all the nice things that if you are in the UI development space, like you kind of take for granted today, like, things like hot reloading, like, and this kind of stuff, like you just, you develop something, you change some code over here, and you don't need to even click refresh on the browser. It just updates automatically. Like we wanted that because, as you can imagine, the experience in what we call our core monolith, like when you change something on some JavaScript file, it's a bit slow. The feedback loop is a bit slow. So we wanted to improve that. I already touched upon the fact that we wanted to make sure that we are able to retain and also hire people that are a bit more specialized also on UI development. And last but not least, we also look at easy of learn, like because a lot of our, engineers, they consider themselves full stack, and they need to be able to pick up these new things without having to burn themselves out. I know that there was some strong opinion across the organization about, just don't let me learn Angular or something like that, right? So everybody had an opinion, to an extent. We try to stay objective. And then last but not least, the footprint and performance of the actual framework. So we did few POCs actually, and I think the two candidates where we actually explore more things in the end that were left there were React and Svelte. And after the results of the POC and also, talking, we have an internal front-end guild as well. So after a few discussions, we decided to move towards Svelte, even if it was a little bit of the bold choice, in the sense that, React is very established. You just got that. There's a super huge community. So there were a lot of positive aspects, on React. As part of this, I guess the bulk of my experience, is also with React, a bit of Angular. Svelte, I didn't do much, but I was excited about certainly, because kind of, was the to an extent, a cool kid in town and brings a lot of interesting approaches, right? Like to how to do UI development. So we landed on Svelte, because we were able to keep a lean payload, like for our user. Right? So that was one thing. Svelte doesn't have really a runtime, while for React, you always need to ship some initial stuff. And we knew that we were introducing this technology, yes, for our, let's say, products that are maybe a bit more internal, but we know that we wanted this stuff also in stackoverflow.com. So actually the POC that we did against the website where we have most traffic and how it would affect the user experience. And in fact, if I take a step back and actually look at what happened today, we have many, we call them Svelte Island. Maybe we will go into that in a second. We have many Svelte Island already running also for stackoverflow.com. So it was a good choice, on that front. I should just make sure that we didn't bloat our user with a bunch of JavaScript that needed to be executed all the time. Another deciding factor was fast startup time. When we compare React and Svelte, we realized that React was taking longer, even for simple things, to actually start up and render the UI, just do its own things and render the UI client side, while Svelte was way quicker on that front. And Svelte is also well suited to author custom elements. We are kind of on a journey at Stack Overflow, as I say, to move from, let's say, centralized architecture. We have this big monolith. We want to move on towards a distributed architecture where we will start to have services, microservices, whatever we want to call it, more a service-oriented type of architecture. So, and those services, they are also already start to have their UI. So you will have, a service responsible for a specific search experience, let's say, and that service will also have its own UI deployed alongside the service. This UI don't need to then be integrated in the rest of the experience, on the rest of on an host application, on an host page. And in order to do that, we wanted to make sure we had the possibility to use a standard such as web component, So web, just to stick to the platform as much as possible. And I would say the last things was also that Svelte is being loved by our community as well. So we look also a little bit at that. Every year we're doing this Stack Overflow developer survey, and it has been scoring top on satisfaction and productivity in that survey, but also not that survey. I know other surveys, that the community seems really to enjoy working with Svelte, and we thought, yeah, okay, that's probably, it was the cherry on top, right? I would say, okay, let's give these things a try. And so far, so good, right? After 1 year and a half, more or less, everything's still working fine, and it's great.
Well, yeah, I'd love to get into that, just to kind of reflect on what you just said there. Although by no means did I go through as deep a process as obviously your team had to decide on which one. It's funny, a couple of things you said there reminded me also why I went with Svelte at the time. And one, for example, was I was actually most familiar with Vue before Svelte as opposed to React. And the last time I'd been using Vue was more, I believe it was a couple of years, as in I had a break of sort of pure programming where, as a lot of CTOs have to, and you have to go do a ton more management than you maybe expected. So when I kind of stopped, Vue 2 was very much the current version. And when I came back to things, Vue 3 was there. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to have to, my understanding at the time was it wasn't a great learning curve between 2 and 3. So I was like, I'm going to have to learn something here anyway. So I've got a choice. Do I learn Vue 3? Do I learn Svelte? And I just thought after the Rich Harris video and also the surveys, I also saw the surveys. I was actually, I think, looking at the State of JS survey that comes out every year. And Svelte had been scoring, I think, for 3 years in a row, very highly. And adoption rate had stayed really quite high as well. So yeah, I said, look, I'm going to do a day of Svelte. And if after that day, I'm happy, this is the one to go with. And I was very happy, basically. It is just such an easy learning curve, I've got to say. When it comes to having, learned React, didn't particularly enjoy it. Vue, did enjoy using Vue, But for sure, Svelte was the easiest learning curve of the three, and just is the most enjoyable. So that is kind of reflects everything I think you've just said.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to give kudos to the community as well, because they did and they're still doing a great job, like with their interactive tutorial. So it was also for us a stack like very easy, like to pick up Svelte and also to help our engineers to learn it. Like it's this fun way of learning something new. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's just sort of dive a bit into, where is it being used and sort of how did it get rolled out? I mean, I think, back in 2023, when you talked about this on the Stack Overflow podcast, you mentioned this very interesting concept of interactive islands. And sort of that was borrowed from another framework. So maybe you could just speak a bit to that, because that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so we internally, like we created this. We needed something to easily convey to our engineers, right? Like different ways of doing things, right? Like, and we decided to go with the interactive islands, like to actually, sometimes we call them also Svelte interactive islands, to describe island of interactivity across our big website, like where Svelte in this case takes over, and essentially becomes responsible to render that part. And those islands, despite the call island, they can be as big or as small as they need to be. So of course we borrow kind of this term from Astro, because Astro is using the term island, but it's not exactly the same concept that we're using internally at Stack Overflow. So essentially for us, they're client-side render components that can be plugged into any of the monolith views. And as you can imagine, right, we had to bring in the tooling, to support engineer to create island in a fast way, right? Because we cannot expect that individual engineer or individual product team that just go off, install Svelte, and figure out how to integrate it within the internal view. So we had to do some work as the platform team to enable the engineers to start building with Svelte. One of the things that we created is also a package that we call Isla Script. This is kind of inspired by what now I'm thinking about Create React app and React scripts. So essentially is bundling a bunch of sensible defaults for our organization, and it creates sort of a CLI that developers can use within their own island. So as an engineer today at Stack, you have a choice. If you want to build a piece of UI that is highly interactive and you want to use a modern way to do so, you can use this CLI, this island script CLI, that will generate for you initially a little bit of boilerplate and a root component, but also will add a bunch of nice things such as prepare you for testing as well. So testing front end is something that we also not doing so great like Stack, and we certainly wanted to improve that. So we took this occasion and say, okay, now we're using a component-based architecture. Is much easier for you to test your components in isolation, and also all the nice things that comes with in modern front-end development. So prettier is there, so we have they can just run the format command, and they will format all the code base, and then linters, and last but not least, a standalone mode for island, which is probably for many of the engineers the most exciting things, because it allowed them to start developing the UI in a isolated environment without having to bring in the whole the whole crazy monolith that is around. So you can just develop much faster in that. You can use hot reload. You can mock if you want API calls to go even faster if that's what you want to do. So we introduce mock service worker to do that. So imagine it as some sort of a package that gives you a nice, let's say, sensible default, right? To start developing in Svelte within the context of Stack Overflow, of course, our code base. And maybe I should also say that it's not that all our UI today, right, like is built or will be built. Like we didn't have the ambition of just saying, okay, now everything is built like across all Stack Overflow. It's just where it makes sense. Like we are building those islands, and on the other end, we still have razor views, right? Like, and sometimes you have static content, and it makes sense to continue using, server-side render razor view. One thing that we've done that though is that we have agreed as an organization to don't use jQuery to build new UI. Like so we won't be able to, of course, migrate all our jQuery because, as you can imagine, it's thousands of lines of code. One thing we did recently though is upgrading to the latest version of jQuery, which was a very interesting project as well. Like this is exactly, we went through the effort because we know that we have so many views. Like you can think about our moderators. It's simply not feasible, like to migrate everything. So we decided actually like to at least to put ourselves to the latest version of jQuery on that front. And for new UI, for new static, let's say UI, we recommend to, of course, continue using Razor views. And if you need to sprinkle some interactivity on those views, we're using Stimulus.js for that, which is part of the Hotwire family. It's been developed by Basecamp, and it's an evolution, right, like of jQuery, of this procedural way, right, like of this adding interactivity to your UI. I think maybe some people like here in the podcast will know HTMX because it's probably, at least in our latest survey, I think it scored very, very well HTMX. Like, and Stimulus is, I would say, it's kind of similar to an extent, like where you can, HTML is still your core things that you deliver, like, and then Stimulus is able to hook into this HTML and just sprinkle on top like some interactivity, which is great, and provide guardrails, a little bit more guardrails to engineer to add this interactivity instead of just going off and either do vanilla JavaScript, which is okay, like we're okay, like of course like we having people do vanilla JavaScript, or just go with jQuery and be in a similar position like when you write this procedural code.
Yeah, super interesting. I love just going back to standalone mode like that, or standalone, I don't know if it was a mode I think you called it, but just that concept of being able to basically just develop components with the data mocked, but just be able to kind of play around with it in isolation. That's super fun. So just looking at, where is it used, I guess, today? I think back in 23, you were already talking about AI initiatives that it was being worked with. And so maybe let's just kind of focus, what were they? And then, in that time, obviously AI, just that catch-all term has, just only got bigger and bigger and bigger. So, and now here we are, about 8 months later talking again. So where's sort of Svelte now, and are those AI initiatives, like, what are they? And yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. After introducing Svelte, and we did some internal training, right, like for our engineers, like, and then we started to see the number of islands like going up, right, like, and then at some point, I think it was around September 2023, like when we say, okay, now it's a good time, like, to get some feedback back, and we ask our engineer, okay, how was your your experience so far, like using Svelte, like that things improved, right? So, and we realized, between other things, that, well, there was a 43% decrease in usage of jQuery, which was great. That's, if you remember, I said at the beginning that 65% of our engineers, like they were still using jQuery in January 2023. So that was good. And another interesting thing was that pretty much all of the new Overflow AI, like this is how we call like these products, like this category of products, features that were implemented in Svelte, right? Like, because as you can imagine, like back then, like we were also in a phase where we were experimenting and try out multiple things, right? Like, so we were trying to learn as well, right? Like as an organization, and having that tool like available to an engineer, it couldn't come at a better time, because it just feel like, oh, I can easily experiment and create a little chat here, like that people can use, like to actually refine like their answer and stuff like that. Like, so today, Overflow AI has evolved quite a bit, like, and still like most of our features like of Overflow AI, like this the UI, of course, like is written in Svelte. So one notable mention is certainly our IDE extension. Like we have an IDE extension that is built entirely in Svelte for Visual Studio Code. And in our, let's say, website, we have several features for our Stack Overflow private instances, like that are leveraging AI, like to, for example, do summarization, like of when you search for something, we provide summaries like of the content that companies have in their internal instances of Stack Overflow. And I should also say that we are slowly also the public platform side of things, like rolling out like as we speak some features like that are based on Svelte. Like so, I'm not sure if you are familiar with Staging Ground, which is it's essentially like a feature that has been introduced to lower the barrier, like for engineers that want to participate in the community to actually ask their first question. So the Staging Ground, or at least part of Staging Ground, will be implemented like using Svelte, because it's pretty dynamic, right? Like you can imagine there is an ask wizard, say here you should have your title, and then some suggestion can come in. Like, so it's the perfect type of UI where you don't want to have some HTML sent to the server, and then you have to write a lot of imperative procedural code to say, okay, if the user type this, then do this call, and then change the HTML over that. So it just becomes a little bit of a mess, right? Like, so I know that the teams behind Staging Ground, right, like it's certainly gonna use some of our new Svelte capability. So yeah, and maybe the last thing I should mention is about our move to, as a tech organization, as I already mentioned, we want to move to a more distributed architecture. We are at, let's say, at the beginning of this journey, like where we're trying to break out some services out of this monolith. Certainly in those new services, like we expect people like to use Svelte unless they have services that they just render some static content. Like in that case, like Razor is still an option, of course, but otherwise we recommend to use Svelte. And we as a platform team, like we're helping out engineers like to actually start up with Svelte. And we have also our first Svelte kit projects, right? Like that we have done, like as part of these new services. We recently had an accessibility initiative, like to improve accessibility of all our products. And we have created a public dashboard, and that whole project has been built like using Svelte kit from the ground up. Yeah, and it was pretty successful project, and we were able to actually go pretty quick, right? Like compared to some other things that we do. So happy to see that.
Great to hear just how, obviously, as you said, I think towards the start of the episode, it's been a success, and being able to bring in sort of more and more aspects of Svelte, and just you mentioning Svelte kit there, that's what I've ended up using as the front end architecture for the product I'm working on. Also agree, it really works. And a good call out on the accessibility. I think that's something that Rich Harris has clearly made a big point of from day one. And, anytime you write a component that isn't complying, you get a ton of squigglies and some kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek, error messages saying, why are you not doing this? Come on. I think that's the best way to approach it is, the framework itself should be really trying to force this to the developer, because, it cannot be ignored. So that's super exciting. And loaded question, but Svelte 5, what's the thought on upgrading?
We're already talking a little bit internally about this. Of course, we're still not quite there yet, because first, I guess, the official release need to be out.
Exactly,
and then as a company, like we would probably wait a little bit and take a few months, maybe like to check that everything was fine. But there is a lot of excitement internally, honestly, about Svelte 5, especially because it's gonna address some of the issues, right? Like that also some of our engineers have reported when they were using Svelte for the first time. I'm calling them issue. It's just like things that make them a bit uncomfortable, and they weren't so explicit. Like one example I can certainly give, right? Like it's just the fact that as of today, right, like in order to declare props, right, like in Svelte, right, you just need to use the syntax, right, that make you think, okay, like you just have let and then the property, and that becomes automatically like sort of a property. It's how you define a property, like. And I think the runes API, it makes things a bit more explicit. Similar story for the state as well, right? Like it makes, with these runes, like it's making things a bit more explicit, and also eliminates the dollar label that was confusing for also a lot of our engineers, right? Like which the reactivity model, right, is getting an upgrade, like, and we are really excited to test it out. And we appreciate as well that they will give us also quite some time to migrate things, right? Because for companies like ours, stability is very important, and you need to provide a solid migration pathway, right? Like, and the fact that we can, they ensure that things will work in Svelte 5, the same stuff that you brought to Svelte 4 still works. Like this is pretty important, because I remember back in the day, with AngularJS and Angular 2, that was a little bit of a nightmare, right? Like to understand that some stuff or some project that I've been on that never been upgraded, like to Angular 2, because it's just Angular 2 plus, because now we are, I don't know, Angular 16. I lost count, right? There's so many releases of Angular. So some companies still, they weren't able to actually catch up like with the framework. So really appreciate the value stability. It's really important to us. Like, and it kind of give us the confirmation that we've done probably like the right choice, right? Like because they are behaving like the core team of Svelte is behaving as a lot of company like relies on them, right? And they cannot just flip a switch and say, okay, we migrate all at once. Like, so really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good call out. The backwards compatibility that has been stated, between 5 and 4, that is huge. I think, again, I could be misremembering here, so I apologize to any listeners who are listening to this and saying this is completely wrong. But I do think part of the problem with the Vue 3 and 2, they had some of those issues as well, where a component was just so dramatically different between the two. So lessons have been learned, I think, is the best way to put it, where especially, React has gone through so many different stages of this, whether it's just not compatible or introducing very strange concepts that then kind of get rolled back after a bit of time. And yeah, unfortunately, I've got to say, I think React is the worst offender here in terms of sort of with the modern framework, sort of in terms of things that they could have done to make, moving through the upgrades less painful. I do appreciate that Svelte takes a slightly more, I would say, mature approach to what that should be. So, but yeah, I mean, Giamir, thank you so much for making the time today, and just, I say, getting to sort of see behind the scenes a little bit on Stack Overflow and Overflow AI and the products that you guys are putting out. And maybe in another 6 months to a year, we'll catch up again and be talking about Svelte 5 and how that's going. So
it was a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I think there is a lot of exciting things going on at Stack Overflow. And, I think we are starting also a bit on a micro front-end journey now, and it's going to be interesting how Svelte then play out in that type of architecture as well, because we're just now starting to learn, right? How Svelte that play out in this type of architecture. So yeah, maybe we'll talk again, sometimes from now.
Absolutely. Anywhere people can, I don't know, follow you, or do Stack Overflow employees, do they have Stack Overflow accounts that they sort of actively answer lots of questions on, or
Yes, we do, but I'm not a very social media, let's say, person. I have for sure. I have a Stack Overflow account. Doesn't have a lot of reputation points. Should probably spend a bit more time answering things. But yeah, I'm also this day, I guess it's X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, a handle @Giamir. As I say, sometimes I post some stuff but as I say, I'm not a super social media person. And I have a website, giamir.com. So when I do conference talk or something like that, if you're interested, you can find me there.
Perfect. Well, as I hope to catch up again in the future, and thank you so much again for coming on.
Thanks.